Okay, so did New York City used to be called New Amsterdam? Yes, it absolutely did. That's the short answer. For a while, what we now know as Manhattan and the areas around it were a Dutch settlement. This whole story starts a long, long time ago, back in the early 1600s. So, yes, New York City was once called New Amsterdam. This is a fact many people know, or at least they've heard a whisper about it. It's a pretty interesting piece of history, and it tells us a lot about how this huge, bustling city got its start. But it wasn't always called that. First, it was just land occupied by Native American tribes. Then Europeans started showing up. The Dutch were the ones who really got things going in terms of a permanent European settlement. Before them, there were other explorers, a guy named Henry Hudson, an Englishman working for the Dutch East India Company, sailed into the harbor in 1609. He was looking for a shortcut to Asia, a northwest passage. He didn't find that, obviously, but he found something else, a huge river, later named the Hudson River, and a bay that was perfect for ships. He also saw a lot of beaver and other fur-bearing animals. This was a big deal. Back then, beaver fur was super valuable in Europe. People used it to make fancy hats. So when Hudson reported back to the Netherlands about all these animals, the Dutch saw a chance to make a lot of money. They weren't really interested in settling the land at first. They wanted to trade. They wanted furs. Soon, Dutch traders started making regular trips across the Atlantic. They'd set up temporary trading posts, meet with the local Native Americans, especially the Lenape people, and exchange European goods like tools, beads, and cloth for furs. These trading posts were often just small camps, nothing permanent, but over time, the Dutch realized they needed a stronger presence to protect their trade and make sure other European powers, like the English or the French, didn't try to move in. This led to the formation of the Dutch West India Company in 1621. This company was a big deal. It was a trading company, yes, but it also had a lot of power. It could build forts, maintain an army, and even start colonies. Its main goal was to exploit the resources of the New World for the Netherlands. Now, one of the most promising places they had found was the area around Hudson's River. In 1624, the first group of permanent Dutch settlers arrived. These weren't just traders anymore. These were families. They came to build a new life. They first settled on what's now Governor's Island, just south of Manhattan. But that wasn't ideal. They needed a more central and defensible spot. So, in 1626, the famous transaction happened. Peter Minuit, who was the Director General for the Dutch West India Company, made a deal with the Lenape people. He bought Manhattan Island. The price is often quoted as 60 Dutch guilders worth of trade goods. That's often translated into something like $24, which sounds incredibly cheap for an island that's now worth trillions. But we have to be careful here. The concept of land ownership was very different for the Lenape. They might have thought they were sharing usage rights, not selling the land outright. And the goods exchange, like tools and kettles, were highly valuable to them at the time. It's hard to put a modern value on it, but for the Dutch, it was a legitimate purchase that allowed them to claim the land. After buying Manhattan, the Dutch quickly got to work. They chose the southern tip of the island to build their main settlement. The spot was good because it was easy to defend, and it had a great harbor. They built a fort there, called Fort Amsterdam. And the settlement that grew up around it, that's what they named New Amsterdam. This was the birth of what would become one of the world's greatest cities. The early days were tough, though. These settlers were far from home. They had to clear land, build houses, and grow food. They also had to deal with the local environment and sometimes tense relationships with Native American tribes. But the fur trade was booming, and that kept the Dutch West India Company interested in the venture. New Amsterdam wasn't just a trading post anymore, it was a small but growing colony, a little piece of the Netherlands planted on the edge of the vast American wilderness. It was the first step in a long, complicated journey that would eventually lead to New York City. Life in New Amsterdam was, for the most part, a lot simpler than what we see in New York City today. It was a small town, really centered around Fort Amsterdam at the very southern tip of Manhattan. This fort wasn't some huge stone fortress. It was more of a timber and earth structure designed to protect the settlers from potential attacks, either from Native Americans or rival European powers. Inside the fort, there were barracks for soldiers, a church, and the Director General's house. Outside the fort, the town grew. The streets started to form, though they were mostly just dirt paths. The houses were built in the Dutch style, often narrow with gabled roofs, made from wood or brick brought over from the Netherlands or made from local materials. They were practical, not fancy, people lived close to each other. The population was never huge under Dutch rule. At its peak, New Amsterdam might have had only 2,000 to 3,000 residents. But what was interesting about it even then was its diversity. Yes, it was a Dutch colony, but not everyone was Dutch. The Dutch West India Company was pretty open to people from other places settling there. They needed skilled workers, farmers, and anyone willing to come. So you'd find people from all over Europe, Germans, French Huguenots, Scandinavians, even some English settlers. And yes, there were enslaved Africans brought to New Amsterdam too, adding another layer of complexity to the society. This mix of cultures, languages, and backgrounds, even in its early days, kind of set the stage for the New York City we know now. It was a melting pot from the start, albeit a very small one. Daily life revolved around work. The fur trade was still central. Beaver pelts were the main export, but people also farmed, raising crops and livestock. There were craftsmen, blacksmiths, bakers, shoemakers. The harbor was always busy, with ships coming and going, bringing supplies from Europe and taking furs back. It was a constant flow of goods and people. Governance was pretty strict. The Dutch West India Company owned the whole colony, so it ran everything. The Director General was the boss. He had a council, but his word was often law. This wasn't exactly a democracy. The most famous, and perhaps most imposing, Director General was Peter Stuyvesant. He arrived in 1647. Stuyvesant was a tough guy, a real character. He had lost a leg in battle and walked with a wooden peg leg reportedly adorned with silver bands. He was determined to make New Amsterdam a proper, orderly, and profitable colony. Stuyvesant did a lot of things to improve the town. He cleaned up the streets, enforced laws about public drinking and Sabbath observance, and even built a wall across the island. This wall was meant to protect the northern boundary of the settlement from Native American attacks and potential incursions from English colonies further north. And guess what? Street runs along the line where that wall once stood. Yep, Wall Street. So, the name comes directly from Stuyvesant's time. He also tried to manage relations with the Native Americans, which were often strained, leading to conflicts like Kief's War before Stuyvesant and other skirmishes. Stuyvesant also faced challenges from within the colony. Many settlers wanted more say in their own government. They felt the Dutch West India Company was too controlling and didn't always act in their best interests. Stuyvesant was not a fan of democracy. He preferred to rule with a firm hand. He was also pretty intolerant of religious diversity, despite the company's general policy of allowing various faiths. He tried to suppress Quakers and Lutherans, but the company in Amsterdam often overruled him, pushing for a more open approach, mainly because they knew religious freedom attracted more settlers. But the biggest challenge for New Amsterdam wasn't internal dissent or Native American conflicts. It was the growing power of the English. The English colonies were expanding rapidly, especially in New England and Virginia. They saw the Dutch presence in between their northern and southern colonies as a problem. It interrupted their territorial claims and made trade more difficult. The English wanted that strategic harbor and the land that came with it. The tensions between the two European powers were always simmering, and everyone in New Amsterdam knew it was only a matter of time before something big happened. Stuyvesant tried his best to fortify the town and prepare, but the odds were heavily stacked against them. The relationship between the Dutch and the English in North America was never truly peaceful. Both countries were major maritime powers, rivals for trade and colonies around the world. In Europe, they fought several wars, known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars, and in the New World, their ambitions clashed directly. The English saw the Dutch colony of New Netherland, with New Amsterdam as its capital, as an annoying wedge between their northern colonies like Massachusetts and their southern ones like Virginia. They claimed the whole Atlantic coast based on earlier explorations dating back to John Cabot. The Dutch, of course, disagreed. By the 1660s, these tensions were reaching a boiling point. King Charles II of England was looking to consolidate his power and expand his empire. He saw New Netherland as a prize ripe for the taking. He decided to just claim it. In 1664, without even formally declaring war on the Netherlands, he granted all the land that was then Dutch New Netherland to his brother James, the Duke of York. This was a pretty bold move. It meant the Duke now owned land that was already occupied and governed by another European power. So, the Duke of York quickly put together a small fleet of warships. 4 ships, led by Colonel Richard Nicolls, set sail for New Netherland. Their mission was clear: take New Amsterdam. This was a classic act of preemptive aggression. When the English fleet arrived in the harbor of New Amsterdam in August 1664, it was a huge shock to the Dutch settlers. Peter Stuyvesant, the peg-legged Director General, was furious. He was a military man, and his instinct was to fight. He wanted to defend the colony, even though he had a small, poorly equipped force. The Fort Amsterdam, was not really in a condition to withstand a major naval attack. It had only about 20 cannons, many of them old, and not much gunpowder. The town's defenses were minimal. Stuyvesant tried to rally the people of New Amsterdam. He urged them to resist, to prepare for battle. But the townspeople had different ideas. They looked at the English fleet, which was much more powerful than anything they could muster. They saw 4 well-armed ships carrying trained soldiers. They also knew that Stuyvesant hadn't exactly been popular with everyone. Many of them just wanted peace and quiet. They were merchants, farmers, and families, not soldiers. They didn't want to see their homes destroyed or their lives put at risk for a fight they couldn't win. A petition was signed by many of the most prominent citizens of New Amsterdam urging Stuyvesant to surrender. They pointed out that resistance was futile and would only lead to bloodshed and the destruction of the town. They didn't see the point in dying for the Dutch West India Company, a company that many felt had neglected them anyway. Stuyvesant, true to his stubborn nature, initially tore up the petition. He was a proud man and felt it was his duty to defend the colony. But his own council, the very people he relied on, also urged him to surrender. They could see the writing on the wall. The odds were impossible. There was no hope of relief from the Netherlands. Finally, realizing he was completely isolated and that his people would not support a fight, Stuyvesant reluctantly agreed to negotiate. He met with Colonel Nichols and his officers. The terms of surrender were surprisingly generous. The English offered to allow the Dutch residents to keep their property, their customs, and their religious freedom. They wouldn't force them to leave. They also said that Dutch ships could continue to trade in the port. These were good terms designed to make the transition as smooth as possible and avoid a protracted fight or rebellion. On September 8, 1664, Peter Stuyvesant officially surrendered New Amsterdam to the English. The Dutch flag was lowered, and the English flag was raised over Fort Amsterdam. The English immediately renamed the colony and the city. New Netherland became New York, and New Amsterdam became New York City, both named in honor of the Duke of York, who had ordered the takeover. The fort was also renamed Fort James. This change happened pretty peacefully, largely because of those generous surrender terms. The people of New Amsterdam mostly just carried on with their lives, now under English rule. The Dutch West India Company lost its most valuable colony in North America. The English now controlled the entire Atlantic coast from New England down to the Carolinas, a huge strategic advantage. This takeover was formalized a few years later with the Treaty of Breda in 1667, which officially ended the Second Anglo-Dutch War. In that treaty, the Dutch essentially swapped their claim to New York for control over Suriname, a sugar colony in South America, which they felt was more valuable at the time. It seemed like a permanent change, but history, as it often does, had a little twist in store. The English takeover of New Amsterdam in 1664 seemed pretty definitive. They renamed everything, started their own administration, and settled in. But history isn't always a straight line. Just a few years later, the Dutch got another chance. The rivalry between England and the Netherlands didn't just end with the Treaty of Breda. These two maritime powers kept clashing. In 1672, the Third Anglo-Dutch War broke out. This time, the Dutch were on the offensive in some ways. They sent a fleet to North America, not just to trade, but to reclaim what they had lost. In July 1673, a Dutch fleet arrived in New York Harbor. The English governor at the time, Francis Lovelace, was away. The English defenses weren't in great shape. The Dutch commander, Admiral Cornelis Evertsen the Younger, demanded the surrender of the city. The English put up a token resistance, but it was clear they couldn't hold out. After a short bombardment, the city, now called New York, surrendered back to the Dutch. For about 15 months, the city was Dutch again. They renamed it once more. This time it became New Orange in honor of William of Orange, the stadtholder leader of the Netherlands. The fort was also renamed Fort Willem. The Dutch set up a new government, trying to reestablish their control and influence. Many of the original Dutch settlers were probably happy to be back under their own flag. They had kept their language and customs, even under English rule. But this second Dutch period was short-lived. The war in Europe wasn't going so well for the Dutch on all fronts. In 1674, the Treaty of Westminster was signed, which ended the Third Anglo-Dutch War. As part of the peace terms, the Dutch agreed to return New Orange, New York to the English. So, by November 1674, the English were back in charge, and the city officially became New York City once more, this time for good. That was the last time it was under Dutch rule, even though Dutch rule lasted for a relatively short period, roughly 50 years in total if you count both periods. The influence of New Amsterdam on New York City is still everywhere. It's deeply woven into the fabric of the city, even today. Think about the language, for example. Many common English words, especially in American English, actually come from Dutch. There are words like cookie kwekje, bosses baas, stoop stoop, waffle waffle, and even yacht jock are all Dutch in origin. These words came into the language during the time when Dutch and English settlers lived side by side in New Netherland and later New York. Then, there are the place names. So many familiar New York names have Dutch roots. Brooklyn, that's from Brooklyn, a town in the Netherlands. Haarlem, from Harlem. Coney Island, from Konijn Eiland, meaning Rabbit Island. The Bronx comes from Jonas Bronk, an early Dutch settler. Staten Island is from Staten Generaal, the Dutch parliament. Even Broadway, one of the most famous streets in the world, was once the Breed Way, the broad road of New Amsterdam. Wall Street, as we talked about, comes from the wall built by Peter Stuyvesant. These names aren't just old words, they are daily reminders of the city's Dutch past. Culturally, the Dutch left their mark too. One of the most famous examples is Santa Claus. The American Santa Claus character, with his red suit and reindeer, is largely derived from the Dutch Sinterklaas tradition. The Dutch brought this figure to New Amsterdam, and over time he evolved into the Santa we know and love. Even the idea of a Christmas tree has some early Dutch roots in American celebrations, although it's also a German tradition. Architecturally, you can still see traces, though many of the original Dutch buildings are long gone. But the narrow gabled houses you sometimes see in historic districts or the layout of some older streets reflect the Dutch style of town planning. The emphasis on trade and commerce, which was central to New Amsterdam, also continued to be a defining characteristic of New York City. The Dutch were pragmatic traders, and that spirit of enterprise continued under English rule and beyond. So, while New York City is definitely an English-named city with a long English and American history, it truly stands on Dutch foundations. The initial vision for a trading hub, the diverse population, and many of the place names and cultural traditions all point back to the time when it was called New Amsterdam, a small but vibrant Dutch outpost in the New World. After 1674, when New York officially became English for good, the city started to change. It grew, slowly at first, but steadily. The English continued to build on the foundations laid by the Dutch. The port remained a vital center for trade. Ships from England, other colonies, and later from all over the world continued to dock there. The fur trade remained important for a while, but other goods, like grain and later enslaved people, became part of the commerce. Over the next century and a half, New York City evolved from a small colonial town into a significant port city within the British Empire. Its strategic location, at the mouth of the Hudson River and with a fantastic natural harbor, was always its greatest asset. It became a hub for commerce, a place where people from all walks of life came to make a living. This was something the Dutch had started, and the English continued and expanded. The American Revolution saw New York City play a big role, often as a British stronghold. After the war, it even served as the first capital of the United States for a short time. This period marked a huge turning point. The city started to shed its colonial skin and embrace its destiny as an American metropolis. The Erie Canal, built in the early 1800s, further cemented New York's status. It connected the port to the vast agricultural and industrial heartland of the country, turning it into the nation's premier economic gateway. As the 19th century progressed, New York exploded in size and population. Waves of immigrants arrived from all over Europe, and then from other parts of the world. Each group added new layers to the city's culture, its economy, and its identity. Skyscrapers started to pierce the sky, subways were dug, bridges spanned rivers. The small settlement of New Amsterdam became the sprawling, iconic global city we recognize today. But even with all that growth, all those changes, the past of New Amsterdam still echoes. You might not see many actual Dutch colonial buildings standing, but the ghost of that early settlement is there. When you walk down Wall Street, you're walking where Stuyvesant's wall once stood. When you hear the names Harlem or Brooklyn, you're hearing Dutch words. These aren't just trivia facts. They're a link to the very beginning of the city. Understanding that New York City was once New Amsterdam isn't just about knowing a historical fact. It helps us understand the roots of the city's unique character. It shows that New York was diverse from its earliest days. It wasn't founded by one group with one single vision. It was a place where different cultures and languages mingled, where trade and enterprise were paramount, and where people came from far away to seek new opportunities. That legacy of openness, of being a global crossroads, started with the Dutch. Today, you can still find places in New York that celebrate this history. There are museums, historical societies, and monuments that tell the story of New Amsterdam. They remind us that before the bright lights and towering buildings, before the constant hustle and bustle, there was a small, ambitious Dutch outpost. It was a place struggling to find its footing, a little piece of the Netherlands trying to thrive in a new world. So, when you think about New York City, it's worth remembering that it's not just one story. It's many stories layered on top of each other, stretching back over centuries. And one of the most important layers, one that shaped so much of what came later, is the story of New Amsterdam. It's a reminder that even the biggest, most modern places have humble beginnings, and that the past, no matter how distant, continues to influence the present in ways we often don't even realize. It makes the city feel even richer, knowing all the different hands and histories that built it up, starting with those early Dutch settlers.